Hi, my name is Jalen. I'm 35 years old. And at 2:43 in the morning, I walked into my grandfather's bedroom and found my father guiding a pen through a dying man's signature. Before I tell you about the moment, a final message made my father fold on a lawyer's carpet. Do me a favor. Drop a quick comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read them. It helps to know who's in the room when the story gets hard. The call that woke me wasn't loud so much as surgical. It cut sleep straight out of me. The screen burned my eyes with that cold blue light phones have in the dark, and there was a name across it that never called unless we were counting hours instead of days. Miriam Rowe. Granddad Ben's hospice nurse. If calm had a voice, it would be hers, always steady, always measured. Not tonight. Jalen, she said tight like words pulled through a narrow space. He was asking for you a minute ago. Can you come now, quickly? There were other words she didn't say, but I heard them anyway. Not much time. I'm on my way. I was out of bed and half into yesterday's jeans before the call ended. My brain threw up a carousel of images that hit so fast it made me dizzy. Granddad's hands guiding mine on a saw in his garage when I was 8. His laugh when the first book club of scrappy freshmen licked grease from their fingers and argued about whether a thief could be a hero. His face the day a doctor said pancreatic, and he nodded like a man who understood storms. 40 minutes to 118 Elder Street. In daylight, that route is all coffee shops and tidy porches. At 3 a.m., it's a city holding its breath. The lights were blinking yellow, the streets were empty, and I kept rehearsing the goodbye you never get right. Thank you for choosing me. I'm sorry for the times I didn't answer. I love you the most a person can. If you've ever made a drive like that, you know how it bends time. The closer you get, the slower everything feels, like the clock itself doesn't want to arrive. I turned onto Elder, and there it was under the porch light. My father's midnight blue Maserati, glossy and obscene in the hush like a tuxedo at a funeral breakfast. He hadn't visited in weeks. He was always landing in Boston, in back-to-back investor calls, closing something too complex to explain. His presence at that hour didn't just feel off, it felt predatory. The key stuck a little in the front lock, old wood, old house, and then the heavy door gave with a sigh I'd heard since childhood. But the sound that usually met me wasn't there. No oxygen hum, no old movie murmuring from the TV he liked to pretend he watched, just a stillness that smelled like lemon oil and flowers someone forgot to throw away. The kind of silence that isn't empty at all, it's full of something you can't name yet. A slice of light cut across the hallway from the study, the room we'd turned into a bedroom once stairs became too much. As I moved closer, the door opened wider and a woman I didn't recognize slipped past me fast like she was trying to outrun her own shadow. 60s, careful hair, anxious mouth, clutching a leather case so hard the handle bit her knuckles white. She didn't look up, didn't excuse herself, just ghosted down the hall and out into the night. 2 men stepped out behind her. One was Vaughn Kramer, my father's forever satellite, the kind of man who carried a pen and a compliment for every room he walked into. He looked gut-sick and glassy, like the air had no oxygen for him. The other was my father, Rhett Montrose. Tie straightened, cufflinks neat, face composed in that expression he saves for cameras, grave, competent, already planning the next move. He looked like he'd just won something. Jalen, he said my name as if he were surprised, as if the house itself hadn't always been mine at 3 a.m. What on earth are you doing here? Miriam called, I said, and tried to look past him. She said he was asking for me. Where is she? He flicked his hand, casual. He has a way of waving away people like they're gnats. I sent Ms. Rowe to pick up a specialty hydration product the pharmacy recommended. She was grateful to have a break. We're just handling some final family business for Dad, tying up loose ends. Loose ends? Funny how words can be both harmless and filthy. I pushed past him before mine became something I couldn't take back. I've been a public school teacher long enough to know when a kid is about to lie. It comes with a smell. Something in the room was giving off that smell. Granddad Ben lay angled on the hospital bed we'd squeezed into the study. The quilt Miriam insisted on tucked around him, blue squares stitched by a church group, soft with 100 washings. His head had slid to one side. His breath rattled like a page turning. His face, once all edges and twinkle, was slack with the hard work of leaving. You learn to read these details when you show up every day. I had shown up. But the details that screamed weren't on his face. They were on the nightstand. A fountain pen that wasn't his, heavy, glossy, the kind my father liked to give as gifts. A leather folio, thin and expensive, propped open to a page with lines printed for signatures. And there, a few inches from Granddad's hand, on the white sheet he would have hated anyone staining, a dot of blue-black ink like a bruise. You have a moment sometimes where your mind can still choose a kind explanation. Maybe his hand shook. Maybe a nurse had been in a hurry. That moment passed when I saw the medication. The morphine bottle stood where it always did, label facing out, as if good intentions could be staged. Next to it, the oral syringe we used. Same type as always, but wrong in a way my body recognized before my brain did. The plunger was at the 8 milliliter mark. His prescribed breakthrough dose was 2. I'd drawn it enough times that even my muscles knew the stop point. Someone had pushed more than a comfort dose into a man whose liver was already fighting for him with a pocket knife. My phone buzzed in my back pocket, a text from Miriam. Back soon. He sent me across town for Polar Spring Platinum water. It doesn't exist. Felt wrong. Are you there? Is he okay? The words slid into place like they'd been waiting. Get the nurse out. Bring in the pen. A notary who looked like a deer on a highway. Witness on payroll. A son who doesn't flinch when the line between help and harm evaporates. I looked at my father the way you look at a stranger who happens to be wearing your last name. You call this loose ends? My voice did a thing I didn't plan, quiet, flat. The kind of tone that makes loud men pay attention. I held up the syringe. Even in that room, in that hour, he flinched at it like it was evidence, not medicine. He dropped the performance. People do eventually. The CEO mask slipped and I saw the man underneath, annoyed that I'd ruined his timing, furious that I'd turned on a light. Don't take that tone with me, he said, and there it was, the bark that thinks volume equals truth. I'm protecting what your grandfather built from being frittered away on pizza parties and overdue library fines. I'm securing the Montrose legacy, something you with your chalk-dusted salary wouldn't understand. Here's a thing I've learned the hard way. Deception hates simple math. 2 is not 8. A man who signed documents every day of his life didn't spill ink on a sheet he could have signed clean. Miriam doesn't disappear searching for a brand of water that sounds like a marketing team, not a pharmacy. None of that adds up if the premise is love. Get out, I said, not a shout. The sort of instruction you give when you've decided to be done with pretending. Vaughn shifted, swallowing hard, and I saw it, a blink of guilt. He had the look of someone who'd walked into a room for business and found himself present at a crime. He opened his mouth, closed it. My father cut him a look sharp enough to shave with. Watch your words, Jalen. My father's voice went silk soft, which is always when it's most dangerous. You step out of your lane here and you will regret it. You don't know what you're suggesting. Suggesting? I moved to the bed and put my hand on Granddad's wrist, not for vitals, I already knew, but to remind myself that a person, not a battleground, lay there. His skin was cool and papery. I held the syringe up so no one could pretend not to see it. This isn't a suggestion. We talk about fight or flight like the only options. There's a third one when the stakes are high and someone's safety depends on clear thinking. You choose procedure. You make the call, you document, you say the words. Miriam, I called loud enough to reach the front door if she had been there. Habit more than hope. Then to my phone, call emergency services. If you've never made that call for someone you love, know this. Your voice will shake and you will still be understood. The dispatcher took my address, my relationship, the facts. Possible overdose, hospice patient, deviation from prescribed dose, 2 adult males present, 1 known relative, 1 business associate, both leaving the scene. Saying it out loud made it real for me and for them. My father scoffed. Now you've done it, he muttered and grabbed for Vaughn's elbow. We're leaving. Rhett, Vaughn whispered, horrified. What about? We have what we need, my father hissed. Let the professionals do their performative busy work. He darted his eyes at the leather folio like it was a life raft. Bianca, the notary who'd streaked out of the room, was nowhere in sight. If you ever wonder what fear does to good people, it makes them run. I don't blame her for that moment. Not anymore. They tried to sweep past me. I stepped sideways without thinking, a door jamb with a pulse, and my father leaned in close enough that I could smell the expensive mint of a life spent never tasting his own breath. You think your noble little program makes you strong? He said, almost tenderly vicious. It makes you soft. The world belongs to those who can stomach doing what needs to be done. The lesson I promised share comes right here when your body wants to answer insult with insult. You can and you will lose more than you gain. Or you can choose a sentence that aims at the truth, not the ego. I kept my eyes on his. What needed to be done, I said, was to sit and hold his hand and wait for me. For a heartbeat, there was a person in his face I recognized, a young version of him who might have wanted to be better. Then it shut like a door with a coded lock. He shouldered past. Vaughn, as he followed, let one string of words fall like contraband. "I didn't know about the dose," he said, barely moving his lips. "I swear." Then the front door opened and closed, and their cologne was the only thing they left. The silence that followed had a sound. It was the house bracing itself. I pulled the folio shut without reading a line. I wouldn't give that paper the dignity of my eyes and moved the pen out of reach. I took the morphine bottle, the syringe, the plastic med log Miriam kept immaculate, and laid them out in a neat row on the dresser, clean, visible, undeniable. When strangers would walk in with their bags and clipped voices, I wanted them to see without me needing to convince. The sirens arrived as a low hum at first, then a crescendo. Blue light strobed in the window panes, and then the hall filled with purposeful footsteps and the singular empathic authority of people who enter grief professionally. Paramedics moved with that respectful speed I've seen them use around the very old and the very young. Questions came in gentle, efficient bursts. When was he last awake? Who administered his last dose? Does he have a DNR? I answered everything I could. For the rest, I said, his nurse will be here any second. Her records are perfect. Miriam arrived 3 minutes later, hair pulled back, breathless fury barely wrapped in professionalism. She took in the room the way only a nurse can, a single pass that catches everything. She saw the dot of ink. She saw the positioning of the pen. She saw the syringe and where I'd placed it. And then she did what good nurses do. She made the next right call, not the dramatic one. She documented. She spoke clearly to the lead paramedic, nomming the prescribed dose and the time, stating that she had not administered anything within the window, that she had been sent off-site on an errand that did not exist. She didn't accuse. She didn't speculate. She told the truth like a steady drip. Truth, it turns out, doesn't need adjectives to be strong. A uniformed officer came with the second ambulance. Younger than me, careful eyes. He asked permission to record. I said yes. He asked if there were cameras in the house. There were none. Granddad hated being watched by machines. He asked who had been present. I gave names. He asked where they went. No idea, I said, and let the word taste honest. He glanced at the dresser, the lineup of facts. That how you found it? He asked. No, I said. I lined it up for you. Thank you, he said, and I believed he meant it. They stabilized my grandfather as much as a body on the edge can be stabilized. It felt obscene to call what was happening help. It was more like escorting. The paramedic, Paul, his name tag said, explained softly that the dose on top of his condition likely removed his ability to consent to anything complex, let alone sign. He didn't say the rest, but the rest was obvious. Someone had taken advantage of that. We rolled him carefully, gently onto the gurney. I tucked the quilt around his legs and pretended it made a difference. Miriam squeezed my shoulder once, a pressure that said all the words we didn't have time for. Ride with us, she said. He'll know you're there. On the way out, I paused in the doorway and looked back into the study. 30 years of that room held steady in the air. The blueprint tubes in the corner, the little brass lamp he kept because it made paper look warm, the dent in the leather chair where I'd fallen asleep reading on 100 Sunday afternoons. I had the odd thought that a house remembers. It knows who loved it and who tried to turn it into something else. Maybe that's why the floorboards creak the way they do, protest or gratitude. As we loaded into the ambulance, a second squad car pulled up, lights off. The officer who stepped out was older, heavier, with the face of a man who's heard every kind of lie and doesn't waste breath saying so. He spoke quietly with his younger partner and then with Miriam. He glanced toward me, nodded once, and came to the rear doors. Mr. Montrose, he said, I'm sorry this is happening to you and your grandfather. We'll need statements when you're able. Whatever you need, I said. Do you want us to secure the scene? He asked, careful, like he was offering a kindness he knew would cost me something. The words secure the scene made my stomach flip. Families don't talk like that unless something has gone very wrong. But this is the part of the story where you choose the language that tells the truth, not the one that protects your denial. I took a breath that felt like it scraped my ribs on the way in. Yes, I said, please. If you're watching this and wondering what you would have done, that's your first reflection question tonight. When the person wearing your family name forces you to choose between peace and honesty, which do you pick? I'm not preaching. I'm genuinely curious. I learned something about myself in that doorway I didn't want to learn. I will put a badge between my father and a bed if the person in that bed taught me how to read and how to be decent. The ride to the hospital was all fluorescent hum and intermittent beeps. I kept my hand on the quilt where his knee would have been under it, talking nonsense you say to the dying and the living. I'm here, you're not alone, remember when we built the birdhouse and it fell apart and we laughed, I'm here. Miriam called updates to the receiving team and between them texted quietly. Documentation, I realized, was also a form of love. Somewhere in there, the officer called back to the driver to ask if there was a safe at the house. No, I said automatically, and then remembered the narrow lockbox Granddad kept for letters. There's a tin in the desk, not valuables, just notes. The officer jotted it, not because he cared about tin, but because it meant intent might be written down somewhere. If there's a takeaway tucked inside this mess, it's this. In the worst moments, you don't need perfect words. You need small right actions repeated. Say the address. Say the dose. Put the evidence where it can be seen. Ask for help. Tell the truth. Integrity is rarely a grand gesture. More often, it's a series of boring, courageous ones that add up to a line no one can argue with. We pulled into the bay. Hospital lights flooded the world bright. The team was ready, gowned, gloved, kind. They took him inside, and I followed until a nurse with the authority of a general put a warm palm up and said she'd come get me in 10. I stood there with my forehead against cool glass, breathing like a person who had forgotten how. My phone buzzed again, a number I didn't recognize. I answered because at that point the night owned me. "Mr. Montrose?" a careful voice asked. "This is Bianca Prout." "The notary." I didn't speak, maybe because I wanted her to keep talking, or maybe because anger eats words first. "I shouldn't be calling," she said, swallowing. "I know that. I left too quick. I signed what I was told to sign. Silence, then a small sound that might have been a sob she tried to swallow. "I'm so sorry." "You still can do something right," I said, surprised at how gentle I sounded. "It will matter." "I'm afraid," she whispered. "He knows things about my family." "I understand," I said. Not yet. "But fear is what he's counting on. If you can't speak now, write what you saw and give it to someone you trust. Date it. Keep a copy. This doesn't have to be tonight, but it has to be soon." The words came out like I'd practiced them. Maybe I had in 100 classroom moments where a kid wasn't ready to tell me who hurt them but needed to know I'd believe them when they were. We ended the call without promise. Some nights don't give you the satisfaction of closure. They just give you the next breath. Miriam came back with the attending, a kind-eyed doctor who introduced himself as Darren Park. He spoke softly, fact by fact, like each was a fragile thing he didn't want to bruise. "He's stable for now," he said. "Comfort measures. We can support his breathing a little, manage his pain. I need to be clear. The additional medication on top of his disease likely means he won't regain the kind of clarity you remember. I'm sorry." Clarity, the word hit me like a note I'd hear again later in a different room on a different day, when a camera would play a message that burned the varnish off the table. But in that hallway, clarity meant something smaller and sharper. The difference between love and ownership, between legacy and leverage, between being a son and becoming a thief. I slid down the wall and sat on cold tile because my legs weren't in the mood to pretend. Miriam lowered herself next to me, bones cracking in sympathy. She didn't say it would be okay. She didn't tell me to be strong. She just let the fluorescent lights buzz and the vending machine hum, and after a minute she said, "He always waited for you." I nodded, thinking of the ink dot on white cotton. "I was late," I said. "No," she said, almost smiling. "You were right on time." Maybe that's the real start of this story, not the call at 2:43, not the car in the driveway, not even the pen. It's the decision to stop pretending that family excuses everything and to act like what's true matters more than what's easy. If you've had a night where a single small detail told you the whole truth, a misplaced receipt, a bruise someone called clumsy, an email time-stamped at an hour that doesn't make sense, tell me about it in the comments. You don't need to name names. I've learned that speaking a little truth out loud can be the first step back to yourself. They let me in to sit with him. I took his hand, cold under the quilt, and whispered the goodbye I had rehearsed in the car but would never finish. Somewhere between the lines, I made a promise I would spend the next year keeping, that I would not let the story of his life be rewritten in a pre-dawn room by a man too hungry to remember what love looks like. Outside, Elder Street was still and dark. Dawn wasn't far. Neither was the day a screen would light up across a conference table and my grandfather would speak from a time before the ink stain, and truth would weigh more than money. But that belonged to later. That night ended the way so many nights end in hospitals, quietly with beeps and breathing and a chair pulled close to a bed, and with a new line drawn, not on paper, but inside me, clear and uncrossable. The first day after that ambulance ride dissolved into a kind of slow, bright blur. Hospitals have their own weather. Time there isn't measured in hours. It's measured in vitals checks, in the soft squeak of rubber soles, in the clink of a metal tray sliding past a curtain. I sat by Granddad's bed while machines did the steady, practical work of being present. When the nurse would adjust the drip, I'd read a paragraph out loud from whatever book was closest. Sometimes I picked old favorites, stories about kids crossing impossible rivers and finding their way home. Sometimes I just talked. I told him about a student who'd used a metaphor so beautiful it made the whole class go still. I told him about a stupid joke our custodian told that morning and how it made me laugh hard enough I had to lean on a locker. I told him I wasn't leaving. That day gave me something I'd need for the fight ahead, a slow, quiet certainty. There's a confidence you get from winning, and there's another kind, a deeper one, that comes from sitting with the hard things without flinching. The second kind lasts longer. If you've ever kept a vigil, you'll know there's space inside it where the mind wanders backward. Mine went to the first time Granddad watched me teach. It was a Thursday after school at Northbridge High, in a room with mismatched chairs and laminated posters that had seen better summers. We were piloting a tiny experiment, an open table after hours for anyone who wanted to read and talk. We had no budget. The grant was a dented donation jar labeled for field trips and a plate of store-brand cookies. I remember looking up from a pile of dog-eared paperbacks and seeing him in the doorway, Ben Montrose in his rumpled blazer, an expression on his face like he'd found an old photograph of someone he loved. He didn't sit in the back like a judge. He took a chair at the circle and opened his palm as if to say, "Go on." I asked the kids what had surprised them most in the book that week. A freshman named Malik said, "I didn't know a person could be brave in secret." And I watched Granddad's eyes light in that way he had when someone told a truth he respected. After the hour, while kids negotiated who got to borrow which copy of The Giver, he leaned toward me and said, "You're building something here. It looks like a thread, but it's a bridge." He put money behind those words, not as a grand gesture, but like an architect who knows a structure needs real beams. We called it the Montrose Reading Project because he laughed at anything with his name on it except libraries. He came with me to thrift shops and library sales, kneeling to scan lower shelves like a treasure hunter. He picked up an old copy of The Outsiders and tapped the cover. "This one sneaks up on tough kids and makes them gentle for a minute," he said. He was right. It did. He also gave what money can't buy, time. He sat in the back and listened with both ears. He never corrected, never condescended. He asked questions like a person thirsty for their answers. A quiet thing happened in those weeks. Kids sat up straighter. When an old man with careful hands treats your thoughts like they matter, you start believing they do. My parents didn't see it that way. My mother, Clarissa, appreciated the idea of education the way people appreciate a painting that matches their couch. "Lovely," she'd say, putting a hand on my cheek and immediately checking for lint on my shirt. "But it can't be your whole life." She meant the salary. She meant the car with the squeaky belt. She meant the way my job refused to make a good cocktail party story. My father didn't bother with niceties. He kept lists, metrics, projections, responsible men his age who had IPOs under their belts and watches that cost more than my first year's rent. At dinners in their museum of a house, he would ask pointed questions about advancement and leverage and liquidity, words that sound like progress until you notice they have nothing to do with people. There was one dinner I think of often, a clear night, the kind where you can see your reflection in the windows and mistake it for a ghost. Clarissa had a new stone installation, the kind with a name so specific it sounded invented, Calicata something, and an imported story so long you needed dessert to get through it. My father let her talk because it gave him a runway. Then he set down his glass and launched into a monologue about winning a bid on a waterfront project and losing it to a competitor he named as if the man were a slur. "It's not talent that moves deals, it's posture," he said, slicing his steak. "You look like you can carry weight, they hand you more." Granddad was there that night, thinner but still sharp. He wiped his mouth, set his napkin down, and said, "Rhett, you're confusing the kinds of weight that matter." My father laughed, the sound you make when you refuse a gift because it arrives wrapped as advice. "And you confuse comfort with courage," he snapped. "Your generation had the luxury to be ethical." Granddad didn't fight him. He looked at me. Later, as we loaded dishes, he handed me a plate with a little chip on the rim and said quietly, "Rooms like that test whether you know who you are. If you're listening and wrestling with a version of that room, voices that measure you in a currency you didn't choose, here." A small exercise that saved me more than once. Write down 3 things about your work that would still matter if no one clapped. Pin it where you can see it. Make your choices from there. It sounds simple. It's not. It works. Back in that hospital room, I was living the arithmetic of those choices. The officer came by for a longer statement. Miriam produced a neat, meticulous page from her binder documenting doses, times, and my father's hydration errand that sent her on a 20-mile search for a brand no one had heard of. Dr. Darren Park stood at the foot of the bed and with careful compassion explained how much awareness a person would have after receiving 4 times their prescribed dose. He didn't indict anyone. He didn't need to. The math indicted itself. I texted Sienna that afternoon. We hadn't been anything but cordial in years, a short, intense ride in our 20s that ended the way 2 stubborn people often do, with pride pretending to be wisdom. We found our way back to a friendship that could survive the truth. She worked at the DA's office now. I didn't want a favor. I wanted a line drawn straight. I typed and deleted a dozen versions before I sent. Hypothetical, if a beneficiary arranged for a dying man to sign new documents under heavy sedation, what laws are we talking about? She called instead of texting. You need coffee or silence? She asked, and I remembered why I'd loved her. Silence first, I said. I told her the scene at 118 Elder Street. The syringe, the ink, the notary whose eyes had looked like a trapped bird's. The way my father had tried to make it sound like a board meeting that required signatures more than consent. Sienna listened the way good prosecutors do, without giving you the drama you're already drowning in. When I finished, she exhaled. I can't be your lawyer, she said, and I can't give you inside anything, but I can tell you the shape of what you're looking at. Any will executed under those circumstances would be weak, bordering on farce. On the criminal side, you're in the territory of financial elder abuse, maybe fraud, definitely coercion if you can prove pressure on witnesses. She paused. And Jalen. Preserve everything. Photos, texts. Write down what you remember with times. Don't embellish. Facts are your friend. Bianca, I said. The notary, she ran. She'll be crucial, Sienna said. If she's been intimidated, she'll need to know she's not alone. People do brave things when they aren't the only ones holding the rope. That line sat with me, holding the rope. Integrity as a team sport. I'd spent a lot of years thinking standing up meant standing alone. It turns out courage is contagious, but someone has to go first. The first person after Sienna was my cousin Alina. We grew up like siblings who lived across town. She was in the 2nd year of her residency and had friends in every field because she collects people the way some folks collect concert posters. I texted her, "Can you swing by the hospital? Need your brain." She appeared after her shift looking like a superhero who had forgotten her cape. Scrubs, messy bun, that ferocious kindness she inherited from my aunt Petra. Alina hugged me halfway to breaking my ribs and then got practical. "What do you need?" she asked. "A translation," I said, "from rage into action." We walked to the cafeteria. She bought 2 coffees the color of betrayal and pulled up a chair. "Okay," she said. "Sienna's right. You need documentation and people who will say things on paper. You also need to know the why under the why. Desperation leaves a paper trail." She texted a friend in finance while we sat there, another friend in a bank's compliance department, a third friend who used to work for a pie and has a weird love for public records. Within a day, she had a rough sketch. My father was leveraged to the eyebrows. Projects stalled, loans stacked on loans, a bridge loan that looked more like a plank over a canyon. And then there was a line that made my stomach go cold. Payments to a private service in Armitage City. The euphemism hid what the transactions didn't. The kind of debt that has nothing to do with banks and everything to do with doors you don't want knocking. "I'm sorry," Alina said, reading my face. "I hoped it was just hubris and bad bets on property. This is darker." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "None of that is your fault." I nodded and didn't trust myself to speak. There's a strange combination of grief and relief when a suspicion you never wanted to have turns out to be true. Grief because the person you hoped your father might be recedes another mile. Relief because now you know what you're actually fighting. That night, Alina did me one more favor without telling me until it was done. She asked a nurse friend to discreetly pull visitor logs from the hospice agency, who had checked in when, who had been asked to step out, who had texted whom. It wasn't evidence you could wave in a courtroom. It was a map, and maps, even messy ones, are how you stop walking in circles. The notary's name, Bianca Prout, was the next pin on the wall. I didn't hunt her down that first day. I let the thought of her sit. You can push scared people and watch them snap, or you can make a door they can open when they're ready. I wrote her name on the back of an envelope, folded it, and put it in my pocket as if proximity could turn into bravery by osmosis. When I finally did knock on her door, it was 2 days later at a tiny office sandwiched between a seamstress and a vape shop. The place smelled like toner and nerves. Bianca looked up from a stack of DMV forms and went still. Up close, she wasn't a shadow slipping out of a hallway anymore. She was a person with careful lipstick and a habit of straightening paper that wasn't crooked. "Ms. Prout," I said, "I'm Jalen from the other night." Her hands found something to do, lining a stapler with the edge of a notepad. "I remember," she said. Her voice had the tone of a woman who talks small because no one has made it safe to talk big. "I didn't come to argue," I said. "I came to leave something." I slid an envelope across the desk. Inside was a photo of Granddad sitting with a half-dozen teenagers at a card table, all elbows and grins and open books. On the back I had written, "This is what he built. If you ever want to tell your side, I'll listen." Bianca didn't open it. She looked at the envelope like it was a live wire. "You don't understand," she whispered. "He knows things." "About you?" I asked. She shook her head once, a small, careful movement. "About my son?" She swallowed. "He's in an education program. If something from when he was a kid came out." She trailed off and clenched her jaw as if she could keep the fear from escaping through her teeth. I didn't press. I left the photo and my number and walked out into bright winter sun that felt ruder than it needed to be. Have you ever had to decide between protecting someone you love and telling the truth? I don't have easy advice for that. I only know secrets rot whatever room they're kept in, and sometimes the most loving act is to open a window and let the light in, even if it stings. The person who opened a window for me was the last person I expected, Vaughn Kramer. He called from a blocked number and asked me to meet him at a diner on the edge of town, where the coffee is honest and the silverware comes in a jar. He looked like he'd been awake for 3 nights in a row, and his hands shook as he wrapped them around the mug. "I shouldn't be here," he said without preamble, "but I can't keep swallowing this." He slid a slip of paper toward me like it might bite him, on it, a name and a case number. "That's Bianca's son," he said. "And the sealed juvenile record your father had a pie dig up. It's nothing, stupid stuff teenage boys do when they're trying to impress kids who won't remember them. But it's enough to get him kicked out of his student teaching if someone wants to be cruel. Your father told Bianca he'd make sure of it." I sat there with that tiny rectangle of paper between us and felt a heat rise in me I didn't know what to do with. Anger is easy when it points at a villain. It's harder when the person across from you is complicit and also trying to make a thing right. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Vaughn stared at the sugar caddy as if it held holy text. "Because Ben gave me my first contract when no one else would return my call," he said. "He made me feel like I wasn't faking it. And because I told myself I was just witnessing a signature, I told myself a man gets to do what he wants with his money at the end. I told myself the dose was scheduled. I've been lying to myself so hard I can't hear my own thoughts. I'm not a good man, Jalen, but I'd like to try." He looked up and his eyes were wet in that way grown men hate. "Please try to forgive me for being late." I didn't forgive him. Not then. Forgiveness isn't a vending machine where you put in contrition and get absolution. But I did believe him. And belief is sometimes the first plank of a bridge that takes a long time to finish. I took the slip of paper and called Sienna from my car with the windows rolled up so I could hear my own breath. I read her the name and the case number. "Don't text that," she said immediately. "Write what he said, date it, keep the original." Then she added, "If Bianca decides to speak, I can connect her with an advocate who knows how to keep people safe when a bully has their thumb on the scale." I drove from the diner to the house on Elder Street because I didn't know where else to go. The police tape on the study door looked obscene in a place that used to smell like cedar and ink. In the kitchen, I made coffee by muscle memory and stood at the sink because that's where Granddad liked to stand when he stared out at the gnarled maple and thought about problems until they turned into plans. That's where the next piece found me. In a box of small things by the back door, a rubber band ball, a set of hex keys, a handful of index cards clipped together. On the top card in Granddad's careful, square handwriting, "If you're stuck, go to Gideon. He won't say what you want, he will say what you need." Underneath, the number for Gideon Hale, his lawyer, a man whose office smelled like good paper and stubbornness. I'd met him once years ago when I signed loan guarantees on a used Corolla, and Granddad insisted I read every line. Gideon had told 24-year-old me that a person who reads the fine print on small things is less likely to get fooled on big ones. I rolled my eyes then. I did not roll them now. I called Gideon and left a message that said only, "It's Jalen. I need to talk about Ben." His assistant called back within the hour and slid me into a slot that didn't exist on the calendar. "He'll stay late," she said. "He always does for your grandfather." Driving to Gideon's office, I thought again about the reading project and how it started with a folding table and a few paperbacks and became a room where kids felt seen. Integrity had felt like a solitary oath I made between me and a mirror. Maybe that's part of it. But the other part, the stronger part, was a circle of people each holding a piece of the same truth. Miriam with her charts, Darren with his quiet explanations, Sienna with her insistence on process over outrage, Alina with her maps, Vaughn with his late confession, Bianca with her shaking hands and a photo she hadn't yet looked at. None of them could carry it alone. Together, it started to feel like a thing that could stand. If you're in a fight that feels bigger than you, ask yourself this: who are the three people who would tell the truth even if it cost them? Write their names down, then ask them for something small. People are braver when you give them a specific job. Show up at 8. Bring the statement. Scan the binder. Make the call. By the time I parked in front of Gideon's office, the winter sun had turned the brick buildings the color of warm bread. He met me in the lobby himself, white hair, kind eyes that saw too much, tie loosened like a man ready to take off his armor. He didn't say, "I'm sorry" first. He said, "Tell me everything in order." So I did. The call, the drive, the pen, the ink, the syringe, the errand that was a lie, my father's voice with its bright, practiced authority. The way he'd called what happened, family business, like decency and law were optional in private. Bianca. Vaughn, the slip of paper with a boy's name on it who wanted to be a teacher. Gideon didn't take notes. He didn't need to. At the end, he steepled his fingers and breathed out slow. Ben was meticulous, he said. He never left a door unlocked that mattered. He looked at me over the rims of his glasses. Let your father think he's holding the pen. We will hold the paper. I didn't know what that meant yet, but the way he said it made me believe there was a plan that didn't depend on shouting. When I left the office, I walked the long way back to the car. I passed a storefront with a hand-painted sign that said, "Simply Books." I went in because sometimes the only thing that makes sense is a room full of spines. I picked up a cheap paperback I'd given away a dozen times to freshmen who swore they'd never read a book on purpose. On the inside cover, I wrote, "For the first time in my life with my father in mind rather than my students, people are not projects. Love is not leverage. Legacy is not loot." I bought the book and took it to the hospital and read 2 chapters out loud to a man who had taught me the difference between headlines and the truth, between looking strong and being good, between having power and being worth something. He didn't open his eyes, he didn't squeeze my hand, but I think he heard every word. Hear what I can tell you now from the other side of that week. There's a phase in every hard story where you are tempted to go nuclear, to burn down rooms and lay waste to names. Hold still instead. Collect facts. Name allies. Build the smallest structure that can hold your weight. You're stronger than your anger when other people lean in. As I left his room that night, the hallway was quiet in the way hospitals only are after midnight. I passed a window and saw my reflection, jaw set, eyes tired, a man who looked older than he had 2 days before. I didn't feel brave. I felt like a person who'd been handed the end of a rope. But when I looked down, there were other hands on it. That made all the difference. On my drive home, my phone buzzed. A short text, unknown number. I read the back of the photo. I can't promise court, but I can give a statement for him. I pulled over and breathed for what felt like the first time all day. I typed back, "Thank you, we'll make it safe." Integrity needs community. Courage borrows from whoever is willing to lend. And sometimes the thing that turns a private nightmare into a public reckoning is a notary with a shaking voice, deciding that her son will be proud of her when he finds out what she did. The next morning, there would be signatures that actually mattered. There would be affidavits and sealed envelopes and a meeting on a long table where my father would arrive confident and leave different. But that belonged to the day after this one. That night, I drove to Elder Street, turned on the porch light, and stood in the doorway of the study like a sentry. The police tape fluttered in the heat kick from a vent, and for a second it sounded almost like a page turning. I took it as a sign. I promised the house, and the man who loved it, that I would help the truth speak louder than anyone's money ever could. Gideon scheduled the meeting for a gray Thursday that felt like it had been ironed flat. His conference room looked like every room where big decisions pretend to be civilized. Long polished table, glass water bottles lined with military precision, chairs that swallowed you enough to make you forget to stand. The wall of windows showed the city in neutral tones, as if the buildings were withholding judgment. I arrived early because I couldn't bear to arrive on time. I walked the length of the table twice, memorized the scuffs in the wood, and tried to rehearse the discipline I'd promised myself. Facts first, outrage later. They came in like actors taking marks. My father entered with his lawyer, Delia Winterson, sharp suit, sharper smile, the kind of presence that turns every word into an implied threat. Behind them drifted my mother, Clarissa, wrapped in a grief that looked pressed and starched. Von Kramer followed with the posture of a man who had misplaced his spine. My Aunt Petra slipped into a chair near me, jaw tight. My Uncle Rowan took the far side, hands flat on the table as if testing whether it was real. Bianca Prout came last, small and neat, and chose a seat near the door like someone calculating the distance to safety. My father took one look around and settled at the head of the table, not where Gideon usually sits, but it never occurred to him there was a difference. "Let be efficient," he said, smoothing his tie. "We have a valid instrument on file with probate. This can be a formality." Gideon entered without fanfare, a folder under his arm, reading glasses balanced low. He didn't take the head chair. He took a seat 3 chairs down and let the silence work for him. When he finally spoke, his voice filled the room without getting louder. "Before any reading," he said, "we need to address irregularities. The court prefers clarity, and so did Ben." Delia's smile widened like a blade. "Mr. Hale, with respect, a notarized will executed last week supersedes all prior documents. My client, as executor and sole beneficiary, is prepared to proceed." Gideon nodded, patient. "A document was signed," he said. "Whether it is a will is a question of capacity and coercion." He lifted a page from his folder and placed it gently atop the table where everyone could see the letterhead. "From Dr. Darren Park. He treated Ben the night in question. He notes that 4 times the prescribed breakthrough dose of morphine had been administered within an hour of the signing." He paused to let the numbers sit. "Dr. Park's professional opinion is that Mr. Montrose could not understand, consider, or consent to complex legal decisions at that time." Delia's hand made a small wave of dismissal. "Hospitals cover themselves," she said. "Opinions, the law cares for signatures." "Only when they mean something," Gideon said and turned another page. "Miriam Rose contemporaneous log," he read, voice steady. 1:38 a.m. patient calm, oriented to person, requires no additional dose. 1:52 a.m. called away by family member to procure an item unavailable at pharmacy. 2:43 a.m. returned. Patient displays shallow respirations, unresponsive to voice. Unauthorized dose indicated by syringe position and timing. Law enforcement notified. He laid the log beside the doctor's letter, like 2 lines meeting at a right angle. If you've ever sat at a table where truth had to prove it belonged there, you know this feeling. Everything in you wants to pound the wood and shout. It almost never helps. The better way is to let the facts do what facts do if you give them room, collect, align way. My father leaned back, making a show of calm that edged into smirk. "Ben had a lucid moment," he said. "He spoke clearly about consolidating assets. He wanted decisive stewardship." He gave me a paternal look I'd seen my whole childhood. He was tired of sentimental projects. "Were you present for the dozing?" Gideon asked, mild as rain. "I comforted my father," he said. "Did you administer any medication?" Gideon asked. "My focus was on my father's peace," he said, and I watched Delia's shoe nudge his under the table. She didn't need to say don't answer, she radiated it. Gideon closed the medical folder as if placing a book back on a shelf. "Under other circumstances," he said, "this would be a heartbreaking family dispute. Unfortunately, we have additional issues. They concern the notary." Bianca went still in her chair. She kept her eyes on her lap. My father turned his gaze to her and lowered his voice to velvet. "Ms. Prout," he said, "please confirm the decedent signed of his own free will." Bianca's throat worked. I could feel the room leaning toward her fear the way a crowd shifts toward a cliff's edge. I remembered the photo I'd left on her desk, Granddad at the card table, kids finding their way into their own words. I kept my eyes on her and thought, let her borrow my steadiness. Gideon didn't push. He simply asked, "Ms. Prout, did anyone contact you prior to the signing regarding your son?" The softest sound escaped her, a breath that realized it had been held too long. She lifted her face. "Yes," she said, voice thin, "Mr. Montrose." The way she said my father's name had no title in it. "He said he had access to a sealed record. My son made a mistake when he was 16. It was stupid and small. He wants to teach. The university would." She glanced at my mother as if expecting judgment. My mother stared at the water bottle as if it could explain any of us. Bianca pressed on. "Mr. Montrose told me if I didn't witness the signature, he would see to it my son lost his placement." She swallowed. "When I arrived at the house, Mr. Montrose Sr. was not awake. He wasn't there. He couldn't hold the pen." Her hands shook in the air as if she were still lifting the weight of another man's fingers. "Mr. Montrose," she flicked her eyes to my father and away, put the pen in his father's hand and moved it. Delia was on her feet before Bianca finished. "We object to this entire line." The witness is emotional, compromised, and clearly being manipulated by the opposing party. Gideon didn't rise. He simply looked at Delia the way a teacher looks at a student who has confused volume with an argument. "Noted," he said. Then to Bianca, gentler, "Thank you. We'll make sure your statement is recorded and protected." My father's control slipped for a moment, a flash of heat. "This is slander," he snapped. "You pressure a working woman with melodrama and expect it to hold up in court." The door opened on a soft hinge. Sienna stepped in, quiet as a second thought, and took a seat against the wall. She didn't announce herself. She didn't have to. She had that courtroom composure that changes air pressure. Delia clocked her immediately and looked away like you look from a window that suddenly shows you a storm. Gideon folded his hands. "We could spend the morning arguing about what happened in Ben's study, or we can let Ben speak for himself." It was then that I understood why he'd chosen not to sit at the head of the table. He didn't need altitude. He needed leverage. He reached into his folder and slid a blue-backed document onto the wood, heavier than paper should be. "This," he said, "is the last will and testament of Benjamin A. Montrose, executed 5 months ago in this office, witnessed by myself and my associate, capacity independently confirmed by Dr. Park on the same day." He glanced at Delia. "It supersedes any subsequent instrument that cannot meet the law's standard for consent." Delia's smile thinned enough to show teeth. "We haven't seen that document," she said. "You will," Gideon replied and put on his glasses. He read the small bequests first, a few specific gifts that tasted like Ben, his old drafting table to Petra, the brass lamp from the study to me for late-night chapters, a donation in Rowan's name to the community health clinic he supported behind the scenes. When he reached my father's name, the room seemed to lean. "To my son, Rhett," Gideon read, "I leave $5,000 and the wish that he uses it to purchase something he cannot resell." He let the sentence rest the way a pastor lets a line of scripture sink in. Clarissa made a sound I'd never heard from her, tiny, like a glass bead tapping a plate. My father's face didn't move, but something in it emptied. Gideon continued, "I leave my residence at 118 Elder Street, my personal effects, and the remainder of my estate to my grandson, Jalen, whose character has been the return on investment I am proudest of." I felt the words like fingers against my back, steadying me upright. "And finally," Gideon said, voice rising just enough to signal the turn, "I direct the creation of the Montrose Education Trust, funded initially with $1,200,000, managed by Jalen for the sole purpose of strengthening school libraries and literacy programs in under-resourced communities." He looked over his glasses at me, and for a second I saw the old man I loved sitting across from me with his pen, giving a nod that meant, "Go on." My father exhaled through his nose, a sound that had always meant danger when I was 10 and still meant it at 35. "He was manipulated," he said. "A sentimental boy got to him. He forgot what this family built." Gideon didn't argue legacy with him. He turned a small remote in his hand. "Ben anticipated confusion," he said. "He left a statement." He pressed a button. The screen on the far wall snapped into motion, then steadied on a frame that stole the air. Ben filled the screen in a soft cardigan and the stubborn light of a man who has already decided what matters. He looked thin, but his eyes were surgical bright. For a breath, he said nothing, letting his presence do what no document could. "Rhett," he began, and even on a recording, his voice reached the room like a hand placed on a table to still it. "If you're hearing me, it means we have arrived where I prayed we wouldn't." My father shifted, a small, involuntary flinch at the sound of his name in that tone. "I know the debts," Ben said, no drama, just fact. "The kind that don't come from banks. I know about the markers you call investments. I know you've been courting desperation dressed as strategy." He breathed once, shallow but steady. "Son, I built buildings because I loved the puzzle of making a space hold people. Some where you decided spaces were for replacing people. That is not a legacy, it is a vacancy." I stared at his hands on the screen, how they opened and closed as if balancing truth in them. "Jalen," he said then, turning to the camera with a softness I felt in my bones, "the house is yours. Fill it with books. Fill it with the opposite of fear. You taught me that a community can be held together by stories the way beams hold a roof." He looked back toward us through the lens. "Rhett, forgiveness is not permission. I love you. I cannot gift you more rope to tangle yourself. If you want to honor me, go where help is given, not where deals are made." He swallowed and gave a hint of a smile I hadn't seen since summer cookouts. "And if a woman named Bianca is in the room, please know I am sorry my son frightened you." Your boy deserves a future judged by what he does next, not by a dumb thing he did as a kid." He stopped there, eyes wet and unashamed of it, and then he said, "Let the truth stand without me." The screen went black. Silence is a tricky thing. It can accuse. It can absolve. The quiet after Ben's face disappeared did neither. It simply hung like a witness who had finished speaking and wouldn't elaborate. The sound that broke it wasn't speech. It was my father's body failing the performance. His chair lurched. He pitched forward. The thud of his temple on the table sent a glass rolling. Clarissa gasped his name with a break in it I'd never heard. Vaughn stood so fast his chair clipped the wall. Petra's hand flew to her mouth, and Rowan reached too late. "Give him room," Sienna said, already moving, voice calm as a surgeon's hand. My father slid to the carpet in a graceless heap of linen and pride. Delia, rattled for the first time, hovered with her phone in the air like a talisman. Paramedics were called. The air returned to its work. Gideon stood, not to comfort or scold, but to make space, the kind of respect you give even to a person who doesn't deserve it yet. I stayed seated because standing felt like accepting a role I didn't want, victor in a scene that had nothing to do with winning. While we waited, Vaughn spoke into the rattle of bottled water and shallow breaths, his voice wrecked. "He promised me 10%, he said to the table, to the wood, to anyone who would hear him. "He said all I had to do was witness. He didn't tell me about the dose. I swear I didn't know. I thought—" His face crumpled at the bankruptcy of his thought. "I thought we were just smoothing. I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Sienna turned then, and the years between us fell away. She addressed Delia first, professional to professional. "Your client is now the subject of an active criminal inquiry," she said. "Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, attempted filing of a false instrument, potential witness intimidation. I strongly advise you to advise him to stop speaking." She faced Vaughn softer. "And you, write exactly what you just said. Date it. We'll make sure someone reads it who won't look away." Delia found her composure and snapped it back on like a cufflink. "Who are you?" she asked, cold. "An assistant district attorney," Sienna said, unimpressed by the icicles in Delia's tone, "and a person who hates bullies." She looked at me briefly, not for permission, not for applause, just to say, "Keep breathing." The paramedics lifted my father onto a gurney. Clarissa followed, one hand on his ankle as if to remind herself he was still tangible. Delia hustled beside them, already on the phone to someone who charges 5 figures to tell men like my father how to survive consequences. When the doors closed behind them, the room sagged. Petra reached for my hand and squeezed until the bones protested. Rowan let out a breath that sounded like the first one he'd taken in a year. Bianca wept silently into a tissue Gideon pressed into her palm without comment. It struck me that every person in that room, even the ones who had failed, had done something brave. Some had been brave late. That counts too. Gideon began moving the pieces into their next positions with the grace of a man who had lived his life reading ahead. "Ms. Prout," he said, "we'll walk you down the hall to my associate to record your statement. We'll ensure your son isn't harmed by telling the truth." To me, "I'll file an emergency petition with the court to invalidate the late-night document and to recognize the earlier will. We'll secure the house and accounts. The trust will be established as directed." To Sienna, with a nod that acknowledged both the law and our history, "We'll provide your office with copies of the medical letters, the log, and the recording. Chain of custody is intact." If you've never seen a room pull itself together around facts, it looks like this. No gloating, no victory lap, just people putting their hands to the next clean task. Here, the lesson I promised each time, foresight beats force. Ben didn't leave us to argue with a bully. He left us a blueprint and the tools to build with. On the way out, I paused at the blank screen and touched the edge of it, silly ritual to thank a piece of glass for being a portal. Sienna came to stand beside me. "You did the hard part," she said. I said. She shrugged one shoulder. "Sitting is harder than swinging." She hesitated, then added, "He'll try to call you. Your mother will too. Decide now what your boundary is and write it down. It's harder to move a line you can see." "Forgiveness isn't permission," I said, hearing Ben's voice in my mouth. "Exactly," she said. "When you're ready, forgiveness can be a gift you give yourself. It doesn't have to be a discount for him." We walked to the elevator with Bianca between us. She clutched her purse like a life vest. "My son volunteers at the literacy center on campus," she said, as if confessing a secret crowned with hope. "He thinks stories change people." "They do," I said, "mostly the people who tell them." "Will I go to jail?" she whispered. "No," Sienna said firmly. The law knows the difference between a victim and an accomplice under duress. You did the right thing today, keep doing it. Gideon caught my eye before the doors closed. Go sit with Ben, he said. He knew the doctors couldn't tell me anything I hadn't already heard. He also knew what matters isn't always information, sometimes it's presence. The hospital smelled like lemon and bleach, and the kind of clean that can't quite scrub grief. Ben lay as he had for days, the machines doing their measured work. I sat and told him about the table, about the way his words folded a room full of noise into stillness, about how Bianca's hands shook until they didn't, about how Sienna sounded like a person who had practiced telling the truth until it came out smooth even when it hurt. I told him what Gideon had read. When I got to the line about $5,000 for something Rhett couldn't resell, I laughed in a breath that was almost a sob. You got him with that one? I said. You always did prefer a good sentence to a grand gesture. If you're watching this and holding onto a secret recording, a file, a letter you're afraid to show because of the explosion it might cause, this is your reflection question. Are you protecting peace or are you protecting a lie? Only you can answer that. I can tell you what we learned in that room. Truth doesn't need you to shout. It needs you to open the door and stand beside it. I left the hospital in the soft end of afternoon when the light forgives the city. On the sidewalk, Vaughn waited like a penitent man loitering at a church he's not sure will have him. I made a statement, he said, eyes on his shoes. And I'm going to tell them about the 10%. It's not enough, but... It's right, I said. Keep going. Will you ever? He stopped, as if the word forgive would choke him. I don't know, I said, honest, but I believe you're trying. His shoulders dropped a fraction. It's a small mercy to let a person know their trying is visible. That night I sat at the desk in Ben's study, police tape gone, the air rearranged by the absence of dread, and wrote down everything I could remember. Who sat where, who said what, the exact words Gideon read, where the water bottle rolled when my father fell. It felt ceremonial, like laying down stones to mark a crossing. I sealed the pages in an envelope and wrote the date. I put it in the drawer with his index cards where he kept truths he didn't want to lose. The phone rang and showed my mother's name. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again, unknown number this time. Delia, I guessed, or someone who gets paid to turn shame into strategy. I turned the phone face down and listened to the house settle, floorboards speaking in the old dialect of heat and wood and time. I thought of Ben's last line on the video, let the truth stand without me. For the first time since the night the phone woke me, I believed we had. In the morning, Gideon would file the papers. Sienna would whisper in the right ears. Bianca would sit at a bland table and tell a stranger's recorder how a man frightened her and how she chose, at last, not to be frightened. Vaughn would keep returning to the same chair until the truth inside him was finished speaking. My father would wake in a room that smelled like disinfectant and realize the floor under his old life had finally given way. And I would make coffee in a kitchen that remembered being loved, stack 2 books by the door for a kid I knew would show up after school pretending not to care, and start thinking about how to turn a house into a library for a city that needed one. Some outcomes look like punishment. The better ones look like boundaries. The best ones look like a blueprint for something kinder than what came before. That day at the table wasn't a victory. It was a foundation. And once a foundation is set, you can stop arguing about whether a building should stand and start the work of making it shelter. The morning after the meeting felt like waking up on a new planet that still used the same sky. Gideon filed everything before I'd finished my first coffee. By noon, a judge had issued an emergency order recognizing the earlier will and freezing anything my father might try to touch. The trust paperwork moved like a well-oiled machine that had been waiting for a switch. I signed documents with a hand that shook only when I thought about how carefully Granddad had built this runway months ago. The house at 118 Elder Street came back to me in more than name. It came back in temperature. When I walked in that afternoon, the air was warmer, as if the building had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. I stood in the study where the worst had happened and looked around with the question that had been knocking at me since the ambulance ride. Now what? The easy answer was protect. Lock doors, guard the rooms, keep everything as it was, but protection can calcify. My grandfather never built anything to be museum pieces. He built for use. So I did what he would have done when a problem felt too big to touch. I picked a corner I could change. I called Von Kramer. It wasn't a sentimental impulse. It was practical and, if I'm honest, a test. He answered on the first ring and sounded like he slept with his shoes on, ready to run. "Jalen," he said, and waited for the blow that didn't come. "You still handy with a saw?" I asked. He let out a breath I could hear through the line. "I used to do trim and build tins in college," he said carefully. "I stopped when, well, I stopped." "Bring what you remember," I said. "Monday, 8 o'clock, no checks, just work. If you flake, we're done." "I'll be there," he said. "Thank you for letting me try to pay back a debt I can't afford." Monday started with a sledgehammer. We took down the formal wall between the parlor and the dining room. Drywall dust floated through winter light like a storm of tiny stars, and the sound of the first section collapsing felt like something old giving its blessing. Miriam came by with sandwiches and 3 rolls of blue painter's tape, because men always forget the tape. Elena brought a speaker and put on low music that made it feel like we were moving in rhythm rather than chaos. Gideon stopped by in his shirt sleeves, rolled his eyes at our cockeyed sawhorses, and loaned us his level. It was the kind of day that leaves you bone-tired and weirdly hopeful. Over the next weeks, the house transformed in honest, noisy ways. We built floor-to-ceiling shelves from raw pine that drank stain like thirsty wood. We left the mantel but pulled the heavy drapes so the front windows could throw big rectangles of light across the room. We turned the old dining room into a wide reading area with mismatched armchairs scavenged from thrift stores and reupholstered with fabrics that didn't match on purpose. Mustard, navy, a print with tiny maps. We converted the pantry into a teen study nook with 2 high tables and outlets enough to power a small band. The kitchen, always the heart, stayed a kitchen, coffee, hot chocolate, a jar big enough for 100 mismatched tea bags. The back room that used to hold blueprints became the quiet room, which is what Miriam insisted we call it because introverts deserve square footage too. I painted the walls a color that looked like a sunrise after rain. Elena picked a long table for the center and called it the Commons. She said communities need a place where any conversation can start. The books came slowly at first and then all at once. Old friends appeared with boxes from their basements. Teachers came with trunkloads of paperbacks that had survived a decade and 3 principles. Gideon donated his entire collection of classic mysteries with a solemnity that felt like handing over a family Bible. We spent Saturday mornings in thrift shops and used book barns, elbow-deep in titles with cracked spines and underlined sentences. I taught Vaughn how to judge a book by its first page instead of its dust jacket. He taught me how to fix a stubborn hinge without swearing. We were not friends yet, but we were becoming something that matters more, 2 men who kept showing up. By spring, the sign out front read the Ben Montrose Community Library in a clean, hand-painted script. Beneath it, a smaller line, riches counted in readers. I agonized over that line more than a person should. It had to say what money never could. On the day we hung the sign, I ran my fingers over the words the way you touch a name etched in stone and whispered, "Look, Granddad, it's going to hold." Opening day was chaos in the best costume. A line formed before we unlocked the door. Elementary schoolers pressed faces to the glass, fogging tiny halos. A retired couple asked about large print mysteries and then ended up leading a spontaneous book swap in the corner. Teenagers discovered the quiet room and immediately filled it with algebra and the kind of laughter that isn't loud but is unstoppable. Miriam organized a table for library cards and processed people like a bouncer you couldn't fool. Elena turned a corner into a pop-up wellness check for seniors, offering blood pressure screenings with kindness and practical questions. Gideon brought a bouquet of pencils and gave a little speech that lasted 90 seconds and made everyone want to do right by paper. Bianca came near the end, hovering on the threshold with her son, height of a basketball guard, eyes of a teacher who already knows how to listen. He introduced himself by his first name and nothing else. He scanned the shelves like they were a new city he'd get to map. "Can I help on Wednesdays?" he asked. "I get out of class at 2. "You just got yourself a job that doesn't pay money," I said, and watched relief pour through his shoulders like someone let down a backpack he'd carried too long. Bianca hugged me quick and fierce and whispered, "He's going to be okay." When she stepped back, there was courage standing next to fear in her face. They looked like roommates who had learned how to share a kitchen. I'd love to tell you what the trust accomplished in metrics, because my father loves metrics, and I wanted to beat him at his game. But what mattered most that first year didn't fit neatly into charts. Yes, the Montrose Education Trust paid for fresh spines in schools that had gone a decade without new titles. Yes, we funded carts of tablets and a few libraries, first audiovisual setups because kids deserve a seat at the digital table as much as anyone. Yes, we provided stipends so media specialists could run after-school clubs without paying for snacks out of their own thin wallets. But the parts I tell people when they ask are the small ones. A 5th grader who decided she liked nonfiction because a book about volcanoes turned her into a research machine. A grandfather who started a chess club because he liked the sound of pages turning around a board. A kid who came to the library angry and left bored, which is just another way of saying he wasn't angry anymore. Meanwhile, the legal world did what it does when it's working. It moved slowly and then all at once. Sienna kept a measured distance because that's what clear ethics look like, but she called a week after the meeting with the words preliminary agreement and conditions, and you won't like parts of this, and that means it's probably fair. In plain terms, my father pleaded guilty to financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and to attempting to file a false instrument. The sentencing avoided prison, his age, the plea, the clean record before this, but it didn't spare dignity. 5 years probation, restitution to the estate and trust for legal costs, mandatory gamblers' anonymous meetings 3 times a week, intensive therapy, 2,000 hours of community service assigned where the court decided, not where he could be photographed for optics. He surrendered his real estate and brokerage licenses and agreed never to serve in any fiduciary capacity again. The titles he wore like armor fell off him, one by one in the quiet clatter of paperwork. Clarissa called every day the week before the plea and left voicemails that were glossy on the outside and frayed underneath. "He's your father," she said, as if that syllable were a get-out-of-consequence-free card. "Think of the family name," she said, which used to work on me when I was 12 and wanted to be invited to grown-up tables. I wrote my boundary down like Sienna told me to and stuck it on the refrigerator next to a flyer for a middle school poetry slam. I will not interfere with accountability. I will not be cruel. I will not be a shield. When Clarissa finally got me live, I read the line out loud. We both cried, and then we didn't call each other for a while. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is hang up before either of you says the sentence you can't unsay. I saw my father 5 months after the plea. The house he and my mother had treated like a display window was staged for buyers. The vases gone, the echo loud. He wore a polo with no logo and carried his phone like a person who had learned not to trust what it delivered. He looked smaller, the way a suit that's too big can make a person shrink inside it even when they don't want to. We stood in the living room with a view of a lawn that used to require 3 gardeners and didn't say hello. "I'm sorry," he said. The words sounded like he had practiced them until they lost their sharp edges. I didn't fill the silence, not to punish, to make sure the words had enough space to mean something. "I thought I was protecting something important," he said finally, voice rough. "I was protecting myself from feeling small." He took a breath. "It doesn't matter, I did what I did. You deserved better. He deserved better." "I know," I said, and hated that part of me wanted to rescue him from the truth he had just managed to say. Growth is weird like that. It asks you to hold steady while a person becomes someone else in front of you. We didn't hug, we didn't pose for forgiveness. He handed me a small velvet box and tried to smile, the kind that says maybe we could call this a moment. Inside was the fountain pen from that night, cleaned and empty. "I can't keep this," he said, and his hand trembled in the space between us until I took it. The pen wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder of what a tool can be used for when a person confuses love with control. I put it on my desk at the library, next to the stapler and a chipped mug that says "Read something that remembers you." Months later, after the library had settled into its bright daily rhythms, I climbed into the attic to wage war on boxes. You can spend your life avoiding an attic because you're afraid the past will fall on you. Turns out the past was waiting patiently, labeled in my grandfather's neat, square hand. Under a heavy canvas tarp at the far end was a cedar-lined chest that smelled faintly of sap and old paper. Inside, journals, dozens. Black, brown, some with elastic bands, 60 years of a life told in the steady handwriting of a man who measured everything worth measuring. On top, a cream-colored envelope with my name in blue ink. Inside wasn't a long letter. It was a brass key, heavy and old-fashioned, and a note that said, simply, "This opens box 312 at First Harbor Bank. What's inside is not more money. It's the rest of the story. Keep it safe by using it. B." I went the next morning because sleep is hard when a key is burning a hole in your nightstand. The bank vault was colder than it needed to be. The clerk slid the metal drawer onto a table with a practiced clank and left me alone like a person asks a priest to leave them with their confession. Inside the box, a stack of letters, a thin ledger book, a small reel-to-reel tape in a paper sleeve, 3 photographs I'd never seen. My grandmother with a mischievous smile, my father as a boy holding a cardboard sword, me at 5 with a popsicle stain like a badge. The ledger wasn't money, it was an ethics account. Every page recorded the choices that cost him something. Deals he'd walked away from, favors he hadn't cashed, jobs he didn't take because they would make him the wrong kind of proud. At the bottom of each entry, he'd written 2 columns. Time spent and people HELPED, as if those were credits that could outlast a balance sheet. There was also an index card with the same line he had underlined in his last journal, the one that has become my north. If you want to know what a person values, look at what they run out of first. I read the journals every night that summer, one after another, the way you read a series that makes you keep the lamp on too late. He wrote like he built, with clean lines and honest weight. He admitted faults the way people usually deny them, plainly, as if hiding would break the thing he was trying to build. He wrote about my father tenderly and unsparingly. He wrote about my grandmother with sentences that made me realize love letters can be blueprints too. He wrote about me in short, surprising bursts that made me laugh out loud. Jay believes kids deserve good paper. He is right. Buy better paper. Those journals didn't make me feel rich. They made me feel chosen for a job that will take the rest of my life to do right. Time moves in human-sized increments when your days are filled with small, repeating kindnesses. The library became a heartbeat. Wednesdays at 3, a crew of seniors who call themselves the sleuths argue about motive versus opportunity like it's a matter of public safety. Friday afternoons, a row of middle schoolers practice standing up to read their poems into a cheap mic, hands shaking until they don't. The quiet room earned its name. The commons earned its noise. Bianca's son shows up like clockwork, patient in a way that makes kids brave enough to try again. I've watched him kneel beside a second grader who hates every letter of the alphabet and turn the word planets into an adventure he wants to finish. When he looked up and saw me watching, he smiled the kind of smile that says, I'm doing what I was built for. If there's a moment that could convert a skeptic to faith, it's that one. I saw my father on a different kind of Wednesday. I was at a red light on the bypass, and there he was in an orange vest, picking trash from the median with a pair of metal tongs. He didn't see me until a bus pulled away, and there I was, the son whose disappointment had finally outlasted his denial. We held each other's gaze through the windshield for a beat longer than is comfortable. He gave a small nod, almost absent-minded, like a man saying hello to a neighbor he's surprised to be glad to see. I nodded back and the light turned green. I don't know why that moment felt holy. Maybe because it wasn't about humiliation. It was about work. He was doing it. Sometimes penance looks like paperwork and apologies. Sometimes it looks like bending to pick up what you threw away. Clarissa left not long after the plea. She moved to a condo near her sister in Florida and sent a Christmas card with a photo of a sunset that looked like a drink. We exchange messages now and then, polite, careful, sometimes warmer when we talk about food or weather or the cut of a dress she found on sale. She is learning how to have a life that isn't a reflection of a man's job. I hope she loves it. I hope she figures out how to be proud of things that don't shine. My father keeps his appointments. He goes to meetings where men tell the truth in folding chairs. He works for a small property company that manages 3 tired buildings and a dozen tired tenants, and he answers calls about leaky sinks and lost keys without rage. He finished his community service and didn't make a performance of it. He calls me once or twice a month. We talk about the weather first, then about something we've both read, which is a miracle I don't say out loud. He asks, how's the library? And I tell him a story I think he can hold. He doesn't ask about the trust. He knows the answer without asking. It's being used up on purpose. People ask me how I feel about him now. If you need a simple answer, I don't have one. I have this. We're no longer at war. The part of me that used to brace for his voice doesn't flinch every time the phone rings. Forgiveness lives in the same house as boundaries. They share a wall and sometimes they borrow sugar. I haven't knocked the wall down. I have opened the door between the rooms. If you're listening to this and wondering whether to give someone a second chance, here's my only advice. Don't decide alone. Ask the people who know your soft spots to stand with you while you think. Write down what safety looks like. See if the person trying fits their actions to your list. Time will tell you what mercy can't, and time will tell you what anger won't. What choice did you make that taught you the most about yourself? I'd like to hear it. The comments section is bigger than you think. It holds more than arguments. Sometimes it holds someone's next brave thing. 5 years have passed since the day a video made a room stop breathing. The library is no longer a project, it's a place. The trust has grown and shrunk and grown again in that healthy way living things do. Northbridge High uses our reading model in every 9th grade advisory now. I spend half my week still doing what I love, teaching these loud, luminous kids, and half visiting schools that want help building their own rooms where someone will ask, what surprised you most? and wait for the answer like it matters. I keep the brass key in a dish on my desk and the empty fountain pen beside it. One is a reminder that the story is the inheritance. The other is a warning about how easily tools become weapons when a person forgets what they're for. Most mornings before the doors open, I walk the stacks and straighten a few books. It's not about neatness. It's about touch. The covers are warm from other hands. If I listen hard enough, I can hear the small sounds of a neighborhood teaching itself to love words. There's a line in one of Ben's journals that I wrote on the inside of my planner so I'd trip over it often. Wealth is the ability to spend your minutes on what you'd be proud to be seen doing. I think about that when I feel the itch to measure my life in dollars or views or titles. I think about it when a student asks if I ever wish I'd become a CEO. I tell them the truth. I am one. I'm the chief executive of how I use my time, and that's the only company I trust with my name. If you are standing at a fork that looks like money in one direction and time in the other, I can't choose for you. I can say this: the money runs out or it runs you. Time, used right, multiplies in other people. I have watched it. A single hour spent listening can ripple into a kid who volunteers 3 afternoons a week who grows into a teacher who changes a school. That's compounding interest, too, just denominated in human capacity rather than cash. Most evenings before we close, a little boy named Cruz comes in with his grandmother. He goes straight to the same shelf, space books, rockets, anything with the word orbit, and he sits on the floor and swings his feet while he turns pages. He's learning to sound out galaxy. Last week, Bianca's son kneeled beside him and guided his finger under the word so gently it was almost a secret. "Say it like you're sending it into the sky," he whispered. Cruz did, and the word went up and came back down like a thing he built himself. I had to turn away so I wouldn't be that man crying in a room full of paper. I don't think I'm the hero of this story. I think the hero is a collection of people who chose a little discomfort over a lot of harm, sometimes late, sometimes early, always at some cost. The nurse who charted the truth. The notary who said, "He scared me," out loud. The associate who slid across a case number and then kept showing up with a hammer. The lawyer who knew when to press play instead of press his advantage. The ex who kept the line clean between her job and her care and still found a way to protect a witness. And a man in a cardigan who understood that the stronger wall is built with honest sentences and the right kind of silence. On the very last page of the last journal, in smaller handwriting as if he knew I'd lean closer, Ben wrote, "Rhett loved money, Jalen loved time. They both became what they chose." I sat with that sentence open on my knees for a long while, feeling its edges. It isn't unkind. It's exact. It makes me look at my calendar like a ledger I'll have to show to someone I respect. I lock the library at night, and the old door makes a sound I now love, a deep, satisfied click. The lamps go dark one by one, and the windows hold the city's reflection until morning. On the porch, the sign catches the last light like a book left open on a table. I pocket the key and head down the steps into air that always smells a little like paper and rain and effort. Would I trade any of it, the night, the fight, the messy forgiveness, for a life where nothing hurt and the money stacked high? Not for a day, not for an hour, not for a single minute that wasn't spent the way it was meant to be. And if you're still here with me at the end of this, thank you. Tell me what you're building with your minutes. Tell me the sentence you're keeping where you can see it. We can make a ledger together that banks in something better than cash. We can write down the ways we've chosen time, and if we do it long enough, maybe one day some kid will point to a shelf and say our names out loud while he learns how to say galaxy, and he'll send our choices into the sky.